I wanted to really focus on, big surprise, is the defense of this football team. There's always these question marks, right? And we're still on the verge of deciding whether or not last year was a successful defense, or some people are. I'm not. I'm fully convinced that this was a top defense in the country a year ago, and heading into this season, head and shoulders above the rest. It doesn't get much better than what the Alabama Crimson Tide has on defense this year, whether it's the depth or it's the experience, whether it's the coaching staff, whether it's the play calling, whether it's the situational awareness of what this defense brings. And, if you, a week or so ago, Pete Golding is talking about, what are the goals of this defense? What is this defense trying to accomplish week in and week out, right? And he talked about holding the opposing offenses, the opposing teams, 13 points. And he talked about creating turnovers. Those are the most important things, right? Well, last year, we look at 19 points per game. We look at 1.7 turnovers per game, and you feel like those are low numbers, right? Alabama didn't rank very highly defensively across the board in many statistics compared to the rest of the nation. Well, first of all, when I look at those kinds of numbers, first of all, stats lie. They always do. They always have. You can learn more about a defense by its tenacity and by its willingness to make plays, its willingness to get the job done, than you can by simply looking at numbers. We're in the midst of the preseason in the NFL right now. If you just look at these quarterbacks' completion percentages, you're not getting the full story. The same applies to the Alabama Crimson Tide defense. So I don't look at Group of Five programs and their defenses at all. There's no comparison of a Group of Five, even a Cincinnati. There's no comparison of a Group of Five program to Alabama and what that team has to deal with year in and year out. So consider some of these stats in line with the Power Five. And then even further with teams that actually played enough games to actually qualify for some statistics. So teams that gave up fewer points per game than Alabama were 8-10. 8-10 against ranked opponents last year. And 3 of those wins came from Cincinnati. So you're already cutting the field in half, right? 8 of those teams played less than 10 games, and 5 of them played 8 or less. And only 3 of the teams that had less points per game than Alabama that were Power 5 programs were Wisconsin, who played 7 games, Iowa, who played 8 games, and Northwestern, who played 9 games. And when you combine their efforts against ranked teams, they played each other ranked, a few of them did, they came out even. So they weren't dominant against any other ranked opponents who had great offenses, right? So look at the offense. Look at the turnovers for Alabama, right? That 1.7 number sounds really, really low, right? Well, Alabama finished 42nd in turnovers in the entire country. That sounds abysmal. It does. However, they finished 23rd among Power 5 teams and 12th among Power 5 teams that played at least 10 games. And again, you could do the same thing. Well, which of those Power 5 teams that played at least 10 games performed well against ranked teams? Because consider the fact Alabama last year played an entire SEC schedule, and then when it got to the postseason, it played the best of the best, right? Oh, Jacob, they played awful against Ole Miss. Yeah, well, Ole Miss put up at least 500 yards in 6 of its 10 games last year, and they were 3-3 in those games. So it did not matter that Ole Miss was putting up that much yardage, that much points, because they couldn't consistently get the job done regardless, right? But they did it to almost everybody. And those that they didn't get 500 yards against, they got around 380 to 460, except for Indiana, who they failed to put up 300 yards on. Oh, well, what about Florida? Kyle Pitts, Kadarius Toney. Those guys played out of their minds. They were draped all over. They got the job done against Patrick Surtain. Florida put up more yards on 7 opponents in 2021 than it did against Alabama. 7 opponents. 7. Alabama ranked 10th in yards among Power 5 teams with at least 10 games, but all of those teams gave up more points per game. So even if you want to go down the yardage route, It doesn't matter. You can give up all the yards in the world. Again, Alabama ranked 10th in yards among Power 5 teams with at least 10 games, but 1 through 9 all gave up more points per game. And only 2 had more turnovers per game. And none had more than 0.2 turnovers than Alabama. And that was Clemson and Pitt. 0.2. They had 0.2 more turnovers in a season in which both of those teams played less games than Alabama. You want to really put that in perspective? Alabama's averages get shot because they played more games than all FBS programs than one. Georgia State. Georgia State was the only other program last year to play 13 games. So Alabama's averages actually get skewed. Because you look at it, that turnover percentage practically ranks first in the country because of the fact that Clemson and Pitt both played less games. You go down to the yardage, you go down to the points per game. All of it is skewed because Alabama played more games and against better competition than everybody else. Now you come into 2021 and it's not a hot take. It's not a hot take at all to sit here and say that Alabama has the best defense in the country. It's not a biased take. It's not even really all that much of a well-informed take. You can just look at the picture and kind of get a grasp of what this team is bringing to the forefront this year. Consider all that we've heard. Consider all of the experience that is returning, plus the addition of Henry To'o, the insane depth on this team. We're talking about a team that has 8 to 9 players on the interior defensive line. That's just hand in the dirt, turf, I guess. Hand in the turf, defensive linemen. You have 8 to 9 guys that can rotate there. It's just in one spot. That doesn't consider all 4 linebacker positions have at least 4 guys that can go. The entire defensive backfield has guys that can go, that can rotate. And when you're looking at Miami across the way in 17 days, all they're bringing to the table is D'Eriq King. That's it. Sure, they've got pieces. Their left tackle is an all-star. He's expected to be a high first-round pick. They've got weapons out wide. They've got a good running game. You know, they're no scrubs. They were ranked 14th in the country in the AP poll for a reason. Miami is a good football team. But Alabama has a history, it has a track record of making good football teams look like poor Sun Belt teams quite often. And sure, those teams might put up some yards because of the way that the rules are bent in the offense's favor. There's nothing you can do about that situation. But when you look at these numbers in a reality that, you know, Alabama is compared against its peers, compared against defenses that had the same opportunities to succeed or fail, Alabama was already top-notch last year. And yet we came out of the Ole Miss game, we came out of the Florida game, and yes, the Ole Miss game was a bad defensive effort. Do not get me wrong. But that was one game out of 13. And when you consider the other 12 games on their own, you're still talking about a top-tier defense. And I'll tell you, you're not going to find a defense. You're not. You will not find a defense in today's football, pro, college, arena, Canadian, powder puff, high school, middle school, elementary. You will not find a defense that will play consistently excellent throughout an entire football season. You can't. It's not built that way. And eventually you're going to find an offense and you're going to play against a play caller and a schemer, you know, who can get the job done, especially when you're talking about Lane Kiffin, who's one of the best in the country to do it right now. Regardless of what weapons he has. He's got a good quarterback. There's a lot of question marks at the receiver there for Ole Miss this year. But there's a reason I'm so high on him is because he's one of the best in the country at what he does. And the rules are in his favor. But that doesn't mean that in today's age of football, you can't still get the job done with defense. Sure. You can't do things like what the 2000 Ravens did, right? In the NFL. You can't do things like the 2009 Alabama Crimson Tide, the 2011 Alabama Crimson Tide. Yeah, those teams had good offensive players. Don't get me wrong. But when the defense is what's carrying the football team all the way to the championship, that doesn't exist anymore. But you still need the defense to win championships, right? And we saw that last year with Alabama because the defense played extremely well against Florida, regardless of what the idea of, what Kyle Pitts and Kadarius Toney and the quarterback got done in that game. Like there's no playmakers will always make plays. They always will. It's just like when Will Anderson lines up against the best left tackle in the country, he's going to make plays just as often as that left tackle is going to prevent him from doing it. Because that's what happens when you play great teams. There's no need to freak out or to feel concerned about much of anything when it comes to this defense because of all the talent, because of the experience, because of the depth, and because of what they're carrying over from last year, which was already the best effort in college football. It doesn't appear that way when you just glance at it, but if you dive in and you look at and compare them to other programs that can at least, hold a candle and be compared to Alabama, which is a difficult thing enough on its own to do, but teams that played enough games to merit consideration, teams that play a tough enough schedule to merit consideration. When you start diving into that, you see that there's really no team in the country that can play defense like Alabama does. Sure, there was a slump. And sure, that slump didn't immediately just go away. That Ole Miss game was early in the season. And it was a poor effort. It was not great tackling. There's a reason all those yards were given up. It was a great game called by Lane Kiffin. But at the end of the day, it was poor defense. But Alabama's poor defenses are still head and shoulders better than many, many other defenses in the SEC, let alone in the country. So to kind of put a bow on that and to consider what Alabama is bringing to the forefront, I'm kind of curious which defenders excite this fan base the most heading into 2021. So if you want to leave a comment in the stream, you're free to do that. You want to call into the show, 205-342-9904. Free to do that as well. I'm a defensive-minded guy. And I staked my claim on this a long time ago that this was the best defense in college football. But really, really look at it. Really, really analyze it. And see what this team has in store. D'Eriq King doesn't faze me. I've been on record. I think he's going to have a couple of runs for over 20 yards. I think he's going to have a good passing game. I would say that against for any great player that Alabama has to play this year. Matt Corral's going to put up yards. Bo Nix is going to play well. Tank Bigsby is going to play well. You get into the playoffs, if you have to play DJ Uiagalelei, he's going to play well. JT Daniels will play well if you have to meet him in the SEC championship. CJ Stroud and Master Teague and Chris Olave with Ohio State, if you have to play them, they're going to play well because they're great players. But if I were to list all 25 potential contributors on this defense, you can't look at me and say that they will be stopped by any of those names or any offensive lineman from having great games in those contests themselves because they're prepared for the success because they've already lived through it. They already did it last year against an entire SEC schedule and three of the best teams in the country in the postseason. This is a team that's ready. And the numbers back it up for once.